Hi and welcome to today's live chapter reading of Hawke by Anise Storm, courtesy of Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Despite the falling snow, the ground beneath Hawke's heavy boots was nothing but dirty slush. In the winter, Denver was a lot like his home in Northern Virginia. The frigid mountain air and heavy precipitation only succeeded in souring his already bad mood. He'd been asleep when he received a call from the local authorities about an arrest outside what would soon be the front door to Sin. Having his club in the headlines before it even opened wasn't something he wanted or needed. Frustrated, he'd gotten out of bed and was now standing outside with his hands tucked inside the deep pockets of his coat as his breath rose from his mouth like fog. His face burned from the sharp wind whipping across his cheeks. There were 100 other places he'd rather be, especially this time of night. Yellow police tape blocked off the front of the building as one of the officers apprehended the perp inside. Evidently, there'd been two separate crimes committed, but he'd only found out about the break-in when he'd arrived on the scene. Even more irritated at this point, he demanded to speak to the one in charge. "I'll be right back, Mr. Hawkins." Now Hawke was stuck there waiting. Having the place barricaded off was the last thing he needed when a construction crew would be there first thing in the morning. It was the third week of January, and if he ever hoped to have the inside done before Valentine's Day, Hawke knew he needed to get started on it. His plan had been to open Sin with a masquerade party, and he was determined to make sure these random events didn't cause any insurmountable setbacks. Fuck, he cursed loudly. He'd forgotten all about having booked an appointment in the morning with the company that would plan the grand opening. If the scene was going to take any length of time to be swept and cleared, it'd be best to cancel the booking and reschedule for a later date. That was all but impossible now, since he'd set up an 8 a.m. meeting. It was now after midnight, and he didn't even remember the name of the planner or her company. He'd gotten a few recommendations and picked one that had availability. All he could remember was the assistant's name, Sherry. That'll do a hell of a lot of good now. He gribbled. So far this investment had been one issue after another. From the hold-up with the building permits to getting the utilities checked turned on, he thought when those two problems had been solved that things would get back on track. Little did he know abandoned buildings like the one he purchased drew drug dealers, prostitutes and worse to the area. He should have never purchased this property, but hindsight was 2020. Growing more impatient, he dug his phone out of his pocket and checked the time on the home screen. For fuck's sake, what are they doing in there? His question seemed to be answered when he heard voices and saw a police officer emerge from the interior with some juvenile delinquent in handcuffs. He was initially struck by the sight. The kid could have been no more than 13 or 14. Dark, shaggy hair hung underneath his left eye. More saddened now than annoyed, he watched the child as he was led to and then stuffed into the back seat of the cruiser. Their eyes met at that point. The hollowness in them reminded Hawke of his own youth, back when he was a different person in a much different life. Somewhat haunted to this very day by the things he'd seen and done during that time, he could only shake his head. Hopefully the guy walking towards him was the one in charge. Just as he was about to speak, the man beat him to it. "Are you Mr. Hawkins?" "Yeah," came his gruff response. "What the hell happened inside?" "Stay here for a few minutes, please," he instructed, and Hawke watched as he walked over to the car with the kid inside. "You've got to be fucking kidding me." Hawke watched the two officers as they talked to one another. Time was money, and if he couldn't get everything cleared, he'd rapidly waste both. In addition to his dwindling patience, the weather was getting even more dreadful. Even though DC got its share of cold and snow, he'd yet to acclimate to what he'd been told was normal there in Denver at this time of year. Deciding to turn his focus away from the officers, Hawke looked at the building. There were no chalk outlines, so that had been a plus. Without any signs of serious injury, hopefully the only crime committed was something that could be wrapped up fairly soon, so he could get back to his hotel and some semblance of warmth. As the officers continued to talk, he looked at the back seat of the car. The kid had his face pressed against the window as he stared at Hawke with dead eyes. What was his story? Hawke finally shook his head dryly, knowing it could be any number of things. He'd once been in a similar state. Having been in and out of foster homes since he was 11, Hawke had gotten into his fair share of trouble. Some of it had been minor infractions, others had been much more serious. If it hadn't been for Kane Stevens, there was no telling where he'd be today. The options pretty much come down to jail or death. Like the kid the two of them had once been, the boy currently watching him seemed to be on the same path. Sorry for the delay, an officer said, interrupting his thoughts. Hawke turned and saw the man's outstretched hand. My name's Jack. By habit he shook his hand. What the hell happened in there? Jack looked between Hawke and the car before responding. Whiteside and I had been patrolling the area when we noticed what appeared to be a drug dealing process. We caught this kid on the corner trying to sell pills to a few others. Hawke shook his head. At this time of night? He'd asked the question but didn't wait for an answer. Remembering the busy day ahead of him, he looked over his shoulder at his property. Are you going to remove that tape any time soon? The officer chuckled and called to the detective Hawke had seen earlier. He was currently exiting the property. Are we all wrapped up in there, Santiago? The man gave a curt nod but didn't say anything as he began removing the police tape. Relieved that it had been done, he turned back to Jack. Does this type of thing happen a lot in the area? It's hit or miss, really, the officer responded, and then reached into his pocket for a card which he presented to Hawke. There's been great strides made in Lodo over the past few years, and while we do patrol the area regularly, I suggest you get a camera or two for the place. I saw tools and other machinery inside. A lot of these kids come from impoverished homes and would steal anything that could score them money at the local pawn shop. I'll get a system installed, he responded, mentally adding that to his already large to-do list. Very good, you've got my card. If you see anything out of the ordinary, give me a call, he told him before gathering up the rest of the tape. Hawke nodded and took the removal of the barricade as permission to enter, so he stepped inside his club. The officer was right about all the tools and equipment that were lying around. There was everything from drills and chainsaws to coils of copper wiring he'd heard was large in demand. Over the summer and fall, several construction sites in the DMV area had been robbed for the metal. He scrubbed his hands down his face. A lot of progress had been made inside, but he knew Sin had still some way to go before he'd be ready to open the door to the members-only establishment. That reminded him of another pressing task. He'd already sent off for all the necessary background checks on potential applicants. He just needed to set some time aside to go over the remainder of the paperwork. For now, however, he wanted to get back to his hotel for some sleep. Hawke knew he'd have to be back in a few hours. In addition to overseeing the construction work, he had another early morning appointment. The recommendation he'd received touted the owner of the company as being one of Denver's up-and-coming gems in the party world planning. Whatever the hell that means. Shaking his head, Hawke took a quick walk through the place, and after seeing nothing else out of place, he exited the building, locked up, and returned to his car. Chapter 2. Almost 2 inches of snow had fallen overnight, making it more difficult for Charlotte to walk in her preferred black Stuart Weitzman boots. Because of the unwelcome but unusual precipitation, she was left to choose between 3 less flattering pairs that were better suited for the weather. After finally opting for the basic suede, she left her office. Charlotte ran a party planning company that catered to one of her favourite activities. Offering the belle of the ball, her vast experience in Denver's high-fashion social scene helped convince her to pursue something in the same career path, which was why, upon graduating from the University of Colorado with a degree in business administration, she'd opened Platinum Dreams. She'd instantly gained clients due to her family's name, but ultimately it was the quality of her work that made her successful. Most of her clientele had come courtesy of word of mouth, and the one she was on the way to meet had happened the same way too. She honestly had no idea what type of event it was for. All Sherry could glean was the man's name and the address of the venue. As she slid behind the wheel of her Maserati, she immediately turned on the seat warmers and let the engine idle for a few minutes. It was cold as hell outside. When she glanced down at her sweater, she could see the hardness of her nipples through the layers of clothing. Okay, so let's see where we're headed, she said aloud. as she input the address into the navigation system. The 15th Street location seemed familiar, and when the GPS detected a match, she recognised the area. She, along with her best friend Emery, spent a good amount of time at the nightclubs in that area. After putting the car in gear, it didn't take long to reach her destination. Street parking was limited, so she turned into a nearby parking garage. She'd have to do some walking, so her choice of boots turned out to be perfect. She exited her car, grabbing her phone and small briefcase. Charlotte hurried to the side door exit, which would take her out onto the cross street. When completely out in the elements, she felt the wind burn as it swept across her cheeks. It was a shame the full arsenal of gear needed to ward off frostbite always made her look so unattractive. Having already braved the winter weather for the last few months, she kept her head down while she walked briskly down the sidewalk. Finally, she'd reached her destination, and her brow furrowed at the words scribbled across a piece of paper taped to the door. Sin? It didn't sound as grand as its counterparts, but she'd worry about that later. Depending on what the place was going to be used for, she could work with the name. She opened the door and stepped inside, relieved to be finally out of the frigid temperatures. Although the place was still heavily under construction, it was at least some semblance of warm, so she wouldn't complain much. Not sure where she was supposed to go, Charlotte followed the sound of voices and soon found herself in a large open space. It had a stage, but that was it. Her gaze travelled around the room, and she saw what appeared to be a bar being constructed off to the right side of her. Looking around for someone that wasn't decked out in a hard hat, she soon laid her eyes on a man on the corner. She could only see the side of him, but he was a very impressive view nonetheless. He stood tall, at least 6 feet in height, and wore a dark-coloured t-shirt that fit him tightly. Charlotte walked closer, having to dodge a man with a 2x4 before finally reaching him. He was wearing a very distinctive brand of cologne, and she found herself inhaling the scented air, trying to figure out what kind it was. The man was completely oblivious to her presence, typing furiously on the keypad of his phone. She debated momentarily on whether or not to disturb him, before realising his time was no important than hers. She plastered on a professional smile and cleared her throat. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Nathaniel Hawkins," she said, watching the man slowly turn round. She nearly swallowed her tongue at the frontal view of the fine specimen, saying a small prayer that this man was the one who'd summoned her there. If so, she could certainly picture herself working very closely with him. He must have thought the same thing if his intense scrutiny was anything to go by. She stood there while he started at the top of her head and worked his gaze downward in appraisal of her until she placed her hands on her hips. She was about to mumble something sarcastic, but remembered this could be a potential client. "And you would be?" came the curt response. His voice seemed to match his new expression, evidently annoyed that she'd cut short his wandering eye. "My name's Charlotte Maxwell," she stammered, wondering why this man had such an unnerving effect on her. There was something about his voice, but she chalked it up to her own growing impatience. "I'm with Platinum Dreams." Charlotte wasn't quite sure whether she'd expected him to smile or even apologise, but he did neither, instead turning away from her and simply motioning with his hand for her to follow. She shook her head but did so anyway, only because he wanted her services. If this was some sort of nightclub, the type of venue wasn't something she normally arranged parties for, but it would certainly look impressive when listed on her portfolio. Despite her inexperience, she could hold her own with Denver's elite, most of which frequented events at places like this. The man said nothing else to her as he led down a dusted hallway. There were doors, all numbered, which seemed weird, but she didn't express these thoughts out loud. They'd eventually reached the one at the farthest end of the hall, and she stepped through the doorway as he held it open for her. "I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me," he began, and she felt her earlier irritation start to diminish, at least until he continued to speak. "If I may offer one suggestion, Miss Maxwell, dress more appropriate for the occasion in future."